They told me I was born to unite bloodlines, but no one said the blood was my own. From the very beginning, I was not treated as a child with dreams, but as an asset, a bargaining chip in a game I never agreed to play. My name carried weight in the region, not because of who I was, but because of the family etched into my veins. I was the daughter of a noble house, but in truth, I was a prisoner dressed in silk. I remember the halls of my childhood home, vast stone corridors that smelled of cold candle wax and damp tapestries. Sunlight rarely reached those corners, and even when it did, it seemed muted, as though the very walls rejected warmth. I grew up surrounded by whispers, the kind of whispers that spoke of alliances, inheritances, and power. I was too young to understand their meaning then, but I understood enough to know they were never about love, never about me. My father's gaze was stern, his affection measured like coin. He spoke of duty, of honor, of the family name, if these were chains forged upon my small shoulders. My mother was quieter, her eyes darting like a sparrow trapped in a cage. She said little, but when she did, it was always about preparing me for obedience, for sacrifice. I was to be pliant, graceful, and above all, silent. Silence, she told me, was the currency of survival in a world ruled by men with iron wills and darker appetites. Then there was him, the boy they called my brother. He was not truly my brother in the way the world might think. He was a cousin, though in our house, cousin and brother were words tossed about like dice, whichever suited the moment best. He lived under the same roof, ate at the same table, and was presented as kin. To me, as a child, he was simply another figure in the echoing halls. He had the same lessons of duty drilled into him, the same stiff posture, the same mask of nobility. But beneath his calm exterior, I noticed something even as a girl, a hunger, a sense of entitlement that shadowed his every gesture. When we played in the courtyard, he would always take the lead role, dictating the rules of the game, never satisfied unless victory bent toward him. At first, I thought this was childish arrogance, but as the years passed, I realized it was something more. He had already been taught that I was not his equal, that I was his possession waiting in the wings. And I, though young, felt an unease settle in my bones, as though my very future was being sharpened like a blade. The servants knew. I saw it in their eyes when they bowed, when they curtsied, when they exchanged furtive glances as I passed. Some pitied me, though they never dared to speak aloud. Others were complicit, loyal to the twisted traditions of blood purity and inheritance. I once overheard two maids whispering near the kitchens, their voices low. One said, "It's already decided. The girl is his. They will wed her to him." At that moment, my stomach turned. I could not have been more than 10 years old, but those words fell on me like stones. They lodged inside me, unmovable, crushing the child I still was. From that day, the house no longer felt like a home. It became a stage set for a tragedy, was forced to star in. Every lesson in embroidery, every curtsy practiced, every instruction to smile and nod. It was not for me. It was for him. I was being prepared, polished, and presented like a jewel, but a jewel meant to be locked into a crown of rusted iron. The betrayal was not in the act itself, not yet, but in the planning. The betrayal lived in the silence of my mother's eyes, in the cold determination of my father's speeches, in the mocking smirk of the boy who knew he would someday own me. I felt like a lamb raised in a pen, fattened not for life, but for slaughter. They cloaked it in words of honor, of legacy, of God's will. But I knew even then that God's name was being dragged into man's cruelty. There were nights when I lay awake in my chamber, the moonlight cutting thin silver lines across the stone floor, and I wondered if I would ever be free. I imagined running into the woods, casting off my gown, becoming nothing but a shadow slipping between trees. But then I would hear the echo of footsteps in the hall, his footsteps, and I knew escape was only a dream. My fate had already been carved into the walls that surrounded me. I tried to resist in small ways, though I did not yet understand the full weight of rebellion. When they told me to sit by him at meals, I sat stiff and silent, refusing to engage in his smug conversations. When they instructed me to take his hand during ceremonies, I let mine go cold, lifeless, so he would know I did not consent. He only laughed, squeezing tighter, as though my resistance was a game he had already won. I think the cruelest part was how they wrapped it in normalcy, how they pretended this was no different from any other union of noble houses. They spoke of it casually, as though my will, my body, my very soul were already theirs to barter. My childhood became a rehearsal for captivity, and the boy who should have been my protector, my so-called brother, became instead the shadow that lengthened with each passing year. Looking back, I see that betrayal is rarely sudden. It is not always the knife in the back or the poison cup. Sometimes it is a slow drip, a steady corrosion of trust, 1,000 small lies told, until you cannot distinguish them from truth. My betrayal began long before the wedding day. It began in whispers, in silences, in lessons that stripped me of self and molded me into a prize. And so I grew, not as a girl, but as a pawn. Every smile I forced, every bow I performed, every stitch of embroidery in my lap was a link in the chain tightening around me. They thought they were shaping me into the perfect bride for him, the perfect jewel for the family's crown. But what they did not know was this: every chain also taught me the weight of captivity. And those who learned the weight of chains also learned to dream of breaking them. That was the house of my childhood, the house of shadows. A place where love did not dwell, where innocence was stripped away, and where a girl learned too early that her fate was not her own. They called it duty, they called it destiny, but in my heart, I knew the truth. It was betrayal, plain and cruel. And betrayal, once it takes root, grows into something else entirely. Something darker, something sharper, something that waits. The day of my wedding arrived not as a celebration, but as a sentence. I was 16 years old, though I felt centuries older from the weight that had already been piled upon my spirit. The household buzzed with activity for weeks, as though preparing for a festival. But for me, every clattering dish, every bolt of silk unrolled, every candle lit, felt like the tolling of a funeral bell. For it was not a wedding they prepared. It was my binding, the sealing of my cage. The gown they dressed me in was beautiful, but beauty is cruel when it hides chains. The fabric shimmered in candlelight, woven with threads of gold, embroidered with patterns that seemed to dance like fire when I moved. Yet as the maids tightened the laces at my back, I felt as though they were not clothing me, but strangling me. My breath grew shallow, my ribs squeezed. I looked into the mirror they set before me and saw not a bride, not a woman, but a prisoner adorned for her execution. They painted my face pale, smoothed my hair into curls, pinned jewels into my braids. Every touch of their hands felt like another layer of mockery, another layer of silence imposed upon me. They told me I was radiant, that I looked like a queen. I wanted to scream that I looked like a corpse dressed for burial. Yet I said nothing, because silence had been trained into me too deeply. My mother hovered nearby, her eyes hollow, her lips pursed in approval. She did not save me, though I searched her face for a crack, a hint of rebellion. She had long ago accepted her chains, and she would not help me break mine. The church loomed like a dark cathedral of fate, its tall spires cutting into the sky like daggers. The air smelled of incense, sweet and suffocating. Rows of faces turned toward me as I entered, my steps echoing along the stone floor. They were smiling, smiling as if this were joy, as if this union were holy. I felt their stares press upon me, judging, approving, indifferent. To them, I was not a girl. I was a transaction, a bargain sealed in flesh and vows. At the altar stood he, my cousin, my so-called brother, my would-be husband. He was dressed in finery, velvet trimmed with fur, a sword at his hip, though he did not need it. His smirk told me he had already won. He extended his hand to me, as though offering salvation. but all I saw was a trap. My own hand trembled as I placed it in his, not in love, not in devotion, but because I had no choice. His grip was firm, possessive, almost triumphant. He squeezed until my knuckles whitened, as though to remind me in that sacred place that I belonged to him. The priest began his sermon, words of God and covenant spilling into the air like poisoned honey. He spoke of unity, of obedience, of a bond ordained by heaven. Yet heaven, if it was watching, was silent. I remember staring at the crucifix above the altar, at the image of a man nailed to wood, suffering in silence. I wondered if he too felt betrayed by those who claimed to speak in his name. The vows were recited, but my voice was a ghost. I whispered the words because I had to, each one burning like ash in my throat. When he spoke, his tone was strong, steady, loud enough to carry through the entire hall. He wanted the world to hear, to witness his victory. The ring slid onto my finger like a shackle, the weight of metal far heavier than its size. And when the priest declared us joined, when the cheers rang out, I felt nothing but a deep hollow echoing inside my chest. The feast that followed was grotesque. Tables groaned beneath platters of roasted meats, fruits gleaming with honey, goblets overflowing with wine. Guests laughed, clapped, toasted our union as though this were a triumph. I sat at the high table beside him, my body stiff, my face a mask of practiced serenity. He raised his goblet and drank deeply, his smile wide as he looked at me. To them, it was a wedding feast. To me, it was a wake. When night fell, dread consumed me. I was led to the bridal chamber, candles flickering against the stone walls, casting shadows that seemed to sneer. My gown was unfastened by trembling hands, my jewels removed, my hair unpinned. I felt stripped not only of clothing but of self, of every last remnant of freedom. He entered the chamber with the swagger of a man claiming property, not a partner, not a soul. I will not recount the details, for some betrayals cut too deep to name aloud. What I will say is this: the first night of marriage was the night my innocence was buried. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and I learned the shape of my prison more fully. My movements were watched, my words measured, my body no longer my own. He played the role of a loving husband before the world, presenting himself as dutiful and proud. But behind the closed doors of our chambers, his mask slipped. He was not a husband, he was a jailer. He reminded me often that I was his possession, that the family had chosen me for him, that my protests were meaningless. I remember one evening, standing by the window, watching the last streaks of sun fade into night. I whispered to myself that I would rather throw myself from the tower than continue this life. He heard me. He came behind me, his hand gripping my arm like iron. He leaned close and whispered, "You will not escape me. You belong to me, forever." His breath on my neck was colder than any winter. His words burned deeper than any flame, and yet, even in those darkest moments, something stirred within me. Something fierce, something small but unbreakable, a spark of defiance. He could bind my body, silence my voice, steal my nights, but he could not own my soul, not completely. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the chains, beneath the terror, a seed of resistance took root. This was my wedding, not a union, not a blessing, not a covenant. It was a betrayal dressed in lace, a cage disguised as celebration. I had been told my fate since childhood, and now it was sealed with rings and vows, that even as they chained me to him, even as they celebrated their victory, they did not see the truth that burned quietly in my heart. They thought they had broken me. They thought the girl in chains would never rise. But they were wrong. For chains may bind the body, but they also teach the weight of captivity. And those who know that weight also know how to dream of breaking free. It is a strange thing to be alive and yet absent from your own life. After the wedding, that is what I became, a figure that moved, smiled, nodded, and curtsied on command, while the person inside retreated to a small, lit room behind the ribs. He held the key to the outer doors. I guarded the inner one. and in the spaces between his orders and the household's rituals, I began to watch with the attention of a scribe who has been told to record the last days of a city before it falls. He perfected the part of dutiful husband in public. He spoke softly to me in corridors where others could hear, took my arm as we crossed the courtyard, and bowed his head during chapel prayers until the candlelight gilded his piety. Guests praised his generosity, the steward praised his accounts, and the chaplain praised his zeal. To the village, he was a patron who repaired a bridge, sent flour when the river rose, and paid for a new bell rope at the church. He loved being seen doing good. The world was a mirror, and he could not pass one without smoothing his expression to the handsomest version of himself. Behind doors, the mirror cracked. His voice lost the velvet and showed the iron. He did not shout often. He did not need to. A quiet command delivered at arm's length can be more frightening than a scream. He corrected where I put my hands at table, which friends I was permitted to greet, which books were fit for my mind. He told me the hours in which I would be visible and the hours in which I would be still. When I hesitated, he smiled that small private smile, the one that never reached his eyes, and reminded me that the household ran on obedience, and that my disobedience would only make life harder for those beneath us. He proved it the night a maid stumbled and spilled wine on his sleeve. The room fell silent, the way a hare freezes when it senses a hawk. He did not strike her. He made her kneel on dried peas in the pantry through the course of the meal, then sent her away without supper. When I went later with a crust of bread, I was careful. I wrapped the bread in cloth and carried a small jar of ointment for her bruised knees. I told her my name and asked hers. Ellen, she whispered, ashamed to speak above her station. I told her there was no shame in being human, and that she should knock twice upon my door if she ever needed balm, needle, or quiet counsel. Small mercies by large loyalties, and if he was building a kingdom of fear, I would build a republic of witness. I began to keep a record, not a diary of feelings. Those can be bargained away, dismissed as a woman's moods, but a ledger of facts. Dates, names, incidents, the shape of his words, the witnesses in the room, what was served at table, who poured the wine, which messenger went out by which gate and at what hour. I wrote as a clerk might write. In a practiced hand upon thin pages, I hid in the lining of an old prayer book. The scriptures are heavy. Men rarely lift them to search for women's truths. When I feared the pages would be found, I folded them into a hollow behind a loose stone beneath the window seat, tucked in a wax pouch to keep out damp. If he believed I was a quiet wife, he was not wrong. It is only that quiet can be a blade laid flat along the table, invisible until the moment it is drawn. On Sundays, the chaplain's sermons leaned long on obedience. Yet in the margins of his homilies sit laws older and sharper than a husband's temper. The church speaks of impediments to marriage, degrees of kinship for which union is forbidden unless a dispensation is granted. Our house prided itself on purity of blood, a phrase that sounds noble until you count the cousins. I asked the chaplain, gently, if he would teach me canon law, for I wish to be less ignorant and more pleasing to God. Vanity makes men generous to those who admire their knowledge. He lent me a small compendium, a Latin hand too cramped for his older eyes. I read by a rushlight until it guttered, tracing with my finger the branching tree of forbiddance unions. First degree, second, third, fourth. My finger returned to our branch, and I felt the old stone walls exhale cold upon my skin. Dispensations are written things, seals are pressed in wax. A seal is a small moon you can touch. Our family kept its moons in an oak chest banded with iron in my father-in-law's study, a room that still smelled of old ink and nut oil, though its master had been 2 winters dead. The steward had the key, so I befriended the steward's wife with cakes on feast days and visits when her cough was bad, and I praised the steward for his good order any time the ledgers balanced publicly in his favour. Weeks later, when the harvest tally was being copied into fair hand, the study door stood open for air. I passed like a shadow against the wall, a dutiful wife admiring the copyist's pen as she crossed behind him. It was enough to see the ribbons on the rolled grants, enough to note the seals impressed on gifts and deeds and alms. If a dispensation existed, it was not among the family moons. He often spoke of heirs as a man speaks of a promised land. He spoke of sons as if naming them could conjure them. He counted potential names on his fingers when we walked, and I learned to count the plants beneath the hedgerow instead: tansy, rue, pennyroyal, feverfew, and to remember the old women's whispers about teas that postpone ripening. I took nothing reckless. I took care. I charted the moon's habit in the sky and the habit of my own body. I prayed aloud for children when others could hear me, and I prayed silently to be spared when no one could. He grew impatient, then suspicious, then solicitous in public, and I let him perform concern like a court dance practiced with a tutor. The ledger kept the dates and the witnesses. The ledger slept behind the stone and woke when I opened it with my fingertips at night. In the village I did what he rarely did. I listened when people spoke without watching themselves. I stood in doorways of cottages and asked after calves, roofs, and sick mothers. I brought linen when a child coughed. People tell the truth to the person who carries their small griefs from the hearth to the gate. In return I heard who delivered which messages, who saw the reeve accept a coin he should not have needed, who swore by the Virgin that the priest had been pressed by my husband to say a word in favor of our marriage's sanctity, as if piety could be ordered like meat for a feast. One widow told me that when the banns had been called, the chaplain's voice had caught, not on my name, but on the phrase consanguinitas. She did not know the word, but she remembered the sound of a man stepping around a stone in the road and pretending he had not stumbled. I practiced invisibility until I could enter a room as a change in temperature rather than a presence. I learned the steps of his day, the way a hunter learns the steps of a stag, when he rose, when he walked, which corridors he favored, which corners he assumed were empty. He carried a small silver reliquary to chapel on certain mornings, a relic of a saint whose name he mispronounced and whose humility he misused. One morning he left it upon the bench by the south door. I waited until the pigeons in the eaves had shifted 3 times, then opened it. There was no bone, no parchment, no hair, only a twist of paper on which he had written a vow to be victorious in all things. He had made a relic of himself. I laughed then, very quietly, and returned it to its place. Pride will always be the hand that lifts a mask for just a heartbeat. Ellen grew braver about knocking twice on my door. She told me which footman carried tales to my husband and which carried tales to my mother-in-law, and how the tales were different by the time they climbed the stair. She told me which footfalls belonged to the steward and which to the bailiff when I could not see the shadows. She told me who in the kitchen wept when the marriage bed sheets were displayed, who in the stables cursed under his breath when a foal was sold to pay for a new tapestry, and which of the scullery boys snuck bread to the old hound that my husband had decided no longer matched the house's dignity. A house is a living creature if you listen to its veins. I listened. The ledger fattened on small truths that, added together, weighed more than any grand speech. There were moments I almost forgot to be afraid. Standing with the village women as they beat rugs by the river, lifting and striking in a rhythm older than our sorrow, I felt what it might be to be simply a person among persons. They laughed and shouted over the water, their arms strong, their spines straight. My hands learned the weight of common work again, and in that weight I remembered the weight of my own self. I returned to the house through the orchard, cheeks warmed by the sun, and I met him at the porch steps. He lifted my chin with 2 fingers and asked where I had been. I said, truthfully, by the river. He smiled a small smile and said I had colour in my face, and that it became me. And then he told Ellen to bring me my embroidery, so I might sit with the proper grace expected of my name. On the night of the Michaelmas feast, when the hall smelled of cinnamon and roasted pears, he stood to toast the house. He spoke of legacy, of faith, of providence. He lifted his goblet to me and called me the jewel of our future. The people cheered because their places at the table depend on cheers. I lifted my goblet and met his eyes over the rim. If he saw a jewel, it was because he mistook hardness for shine. If he saw our future, it was because he did not know I had begun to write a different one in a hand, so small even God would have to lean close to read it. The mask he wore did not slip in public that night, nor the night after. Masks are clever things. They are fitted to the contours of a man's ambition. But masks bruise the skin beneath. You learn the bruise by its color and by where it darkens. I knew where his bruises lay, in pride, in lineage, in the performance of holiness, in the making of heirs. I would press each bruise with a quiet finger in time. The ledger waited. The law waited. The house itself seemed to wait, as if old stones are capable of patience. I could not yet move the world, but I could catalogue it. And I could teach myself the angle at which a blade laid flat becomes a blade drawn. They taught me that obedience is safety. They were wrong. I learned that knowledge is safety, and that witnesses are armor. I learned that a woman who appears to be writing prayers might in truth be drawing a map out of a labyrinth. And I learned that a brother who becomes a husband is not a fate, but a confession the family makes about itself, a confession they pray the one will learn to read. I was learning, and when I finished learning, I would begin. History is written in the ink of men who never lived inside women's cages. They record battles, treaties, coronations, and deaths. They rarely record the cries muffled by stone walls, or the bargains made with girls' bodies to secure a field or a crown. But if you read between the lines, you see the truth. Whole dynasties were built on the backs of girls like me. Girls turned into pawns under the mask of family duty. My fate was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of a system that valued bloodlines more than lives. My husband, my so-called brother, carried himself with pride because he knew the house had long practiced this ritual of breeding kin with kin. To keep the blood strong, they said. In reality, it was to keep the wealth unscattered, the land undivided. I was a vault to be locked, a key to be turned, ensuring that nothing spilled into rival hands. The irony was bitter. In trying to keep the blood strong, they made it rot. Cousins wed cousins, until sickness appeared in children's bones. Whispers ran through the villages of infants who did not survive a season, of heirs too weak to ride a horse or lift a sword. But these were not spoken of in halls like ours. Silence was always the first inheritance of noble daughters. I began to read not only canon law, but also chronicles, dusty records of marriages, betrothals, and the alliances they birthed. Patterns emerged like cracks in a wall. Again and again, I saw girls handed to uncles, cousins, and so-called brothers. Their names faded quickly, eclipsed by the men they had been bound to. In Mogens, I saw occasional hints: the wife sickly, the wife barren, the wife died young. Always the blame shifted to the woman's body, never the corruption of bloodlines. And I understood, my story was not unique. It was part of a machinery that ground countless women into dust, while men called the dust legacy. Still, betrayal cuts deepest when it is personal. My family had dressed their ambition as love. They told me as a child that we were bound by God's will, that my duty was sacred. Yes, I could see now that it was not God's hand, but theirs. My father's cold stare across the table had never been the gaze of protection. It was calculation. My mother's silence was not mercy. It was complicity. The betrayal of kin wounds deeper than any blade, for it teaches you that even the hands that should shield you can become shackles. He, my husband, wore that betrayal like a cloak of victory. In private, he reminded me that I had been chosen for him, that our union was inevitable, that he owned not only my present but the children I might someday bear. His words slithered into the night air, curling around me until I felt suffocated. Yet I began to see his boasting as weakness. Men who must remind others of their power are often terrified of losing it. I marked his words in my mind the way I marked dates in my secret ledger. Each sentence was evidence. Each humiliation was testimony. There were times I stood at the window overlooking the courtyard and thought of the girls whose names I would never know. Girls who had stood in gowns too heavy for their thin shoulders. Girls who had whispered their vows with trembling lips while men cheered. Girls whose chains had been hidden beneath pearls and lace. I thought of them and felt both sorrow and solidarity. We were a sisterhood without meeting, bound not by friendship but by betrayal. History had tried to erase us, but in the quiet of my chamber, I remembered them all, and remembering is a form of rebellion. It was in those moments that a new truth began to sharpen within me. If they would not record our suffering, I would. If they would not admit the rot in the bloodlines, I would bear witness. Not as a victim, but as a chronicler, I began to write not only what he did, but what others had done. The dates of cousin marriages, the whispered illnesses, the deaths of infants. I was building more than a ledger now. I was building an indictment. Perhaps no one would read it in my lifetime. Perhaps they would burn it when I was gone. But perhaps, and this thought burned bright, perhaps someone, someday, would unseal those pages and see the truth. And they would know that at least one of us had refused to be silent. Revenge does not come like thunder. It begins like a drip of water, wearing a waystone. Mine began with knowledge. Knowledge of laws, of patterns, of secrets whispered by servants, of tears shed by women in kitchens when no man was near. Every piece of knowledge was a weapon sharpened in darkness. And in time, those weapons would turn the balance. Still, I needed patience. To strike too soon would be to lose everything. I had to endure his presence, his control, his smirk when he paraded me before others. I had to smile when guests praised our union, even as bile rose in my throat. I had to kneel in chapel beside him, hands folded as though in prayer, when inside I was charting the path to his ruin. Every bow, every curtsy, every smile was not submission. It was camouflage. If he believed me docile, then he would never see me coming. One winter night, as snow pressed against the windows and the fire crackled low, he boasted of the bloodlines that made us great. He called them pure, unbroken, ordained. I looked at him and thought, purity is nothing but decay when it feeds on itself. What he called legacy, I called rot. What he called destiny, I called betrayal. And in that moment, I swore silently to myself that I would not let my story end as theirs had. I would not be another erased name in a ledger written by men. If I could not undo the chains, I would at least make them visible. If I could not escape my fate, I would twist it into a weapon. The seed of vengeance had sprouted in my heart long before, but now it began to grow thorns. I no longer dreamed only of escape. I dreamed of balance, of justice, of making him feel the weight of every chain he had placed on me. And I dreamed of making the family that betrayed me choke on the legacy they had prized so dearly. For bloodlines may bind, but they can also strangle thus. The betrayal that had begun with whispers in the halls and vows at the altar became something larger. It was no longer just my story. It was the story of countless girls trapped in the machinery of power, sacrificed on the altar of blood. And it was the story of how one girl, forced to marry her own brother, began to shape betrayal into revenge. Revenge does not come swiftly to those who live in chains. It must be nursed in silence, like a fire hidden in the ashes, waiting for the right breath of air to awaken it. In the months after my wedding, I learned that my survival depended not on denial, but on patience. To bide my time was to sharpen my mind, to steady my hand. Every injustice became a record, every humiliation a lesson, every command from his lips a reminder of what must one day be undone. He was careless in his pride, and pride is the easiest flaw to exploit. He believed the household adored him, believed the tenants feared and respected him, believed that the mask of a noble husband was enough to hide the rot beneath. But I had seen his mask slip. I had heard the tremor in his voice when I denied him an heir. I had marked the way he grew restless when I lingered too long among the servants, or when my eyes held a spark of defiance he could not extinguish. He thought he had broken me. yet he mistook silence for obedience. He never understood that silence can also be the sound of plotting. I began with small rebellions, subtle enough to escape his notice. I refused him as, though outwardly, I played the role of the dutiful wife. The herbs I steeped in tea were bitter, but bitterness was a flavour I had long since grown used to. He believed it was God withholding children, a trial of patience and faith. He would kneel in chapel and pray for sons, while I knelt beside him and prayed for freedom. He did not know that my prayers were answered in my own hands. Next, I began to listen more intently than ever. Information is a blade sharper than steel. The steward's wife, the maid Ellen, the village women by the river, they all spoke truths that could be stitched together like pieces of a tapestry. I learned who despised him quietly, who grumbled when taxes were high, who remembered the priest's stumble when the banns were read. I learned of rivals in neighbouring houses who watched with envious eyes, hoping for weakness. I knew that one day, if I moved with care, I could give them the weakness they longed for. It was during a feast that my resolve hardened. He had been drinking deeply, his cheeks red with wine, his laughter booming across the hall. A minstrel sang a ballad of loyalty, and he raised his goblet to me, calling me the jewel of his household. Then, in front of all assembled, he leaned close and whispered a cruelty only I could hear. You shine only because I placed you here. Without me, you are nothing. The guests cheered his toast, oblivious. But I sat still, my smile steady, my heart cold. At that moment, I vowed that one day he would choke on his own words. He had paraded me as his possession. I would make him see that possessions can be lost, broken, or stolen back. The first act of true defiance was not dramatic. It was quiet, careful, nearly invisible. I ensured that the household began to see me, not as his shadow, but as myself. I tended to the sick in the village. I fed the hounds he had cast aside. I listened when the scullery boys spoke of their hunger. In doing so, I built loyalty not with power, but with compassion. They began to look at me with eyes that saw a protector, not merely a lady. My brother husband never noticed, for he was too busy admiring his reflection in the eyes of noble guests. But loyalty is courtesy, and I was becoming wealthy. One night, I sat alone in my chamber with my secret ledger spread before me. The pages were filled with dates, names, patterns of cruelty and arrogance. They were also filled with notes on law, on consanguinity, on the whispers of scandal that could undo him if revealed. The ledger had become more than a record. It was a weapon, a blade honed from ink and parchment. I traced my finger along the entries, and I felt a strange calm. I realized then that I did not need to strike with open violence. I could destroy him with truth. A single whisper in the right ear, a single revelation to the right rival, could bring his mask crashing down. Yet I was not reckless. I waited. I let him boast, let him mock, let him strut. I let him believe the world adored him. And all the while, I tightened the noose of knowledge around him. My revenge was not to be a wildfire that burned everything in its path. It would be precise, surgical, leaving him exposed, while I remained untouchable. The villagers began to trust me with secrets, and I began to spread whispers in return. Small, harmless at first, hints of doubt about his generosity, quiet reminders of his harshness toward servants. I watched as those whispers grew like cracks in a wall. People began to question. They began to murmur when he passed. He noticed the change in their eyes, though he could not understand why. His pride made him blind to the slow erosion of loyalty around him. But whispers alone were not enough. I needed something final, something undeniable. And so I returned to the canon law I had studied, to the truth of our bloodline. If the world could be made to see our marriage not as duty, but as sin, then the mask would shatter. I knew the risk. To expose the truth would be to expose myself. But by then, I no longer feared exposure. Shame is a weapon wielded by oppressors, and I had already been shamed enough. To turn that weapon back upon him was not shame. It was justice. The night I resolved to act, I stood again at the window of my chamber, the moon casting pale light across the floor. I thought of the girls whose names were forgotten, the ones erased by silence and obedience. I thought of their cries swallowed by stone walls, and I swore I would not be one of them. If my fate was to be remembered, let it be as the woman who turned betrayal into vengeance. I did not yet know the exact moment I would strike, nor how the world would react, but I knew this. I had waited long enough. The fire in the ashes was ready to rise. My revenge was no longer a dream. It was a plan, and it would not be denied. There comes a point when patience turns into action, when the fire hidden beneath the ashes cannot be smothered any longer. 4 years I had endured the mask of a husband who was also my brother, the betrayal of parents who had bartered my life, the silence of a household complicit in my chains. I had watched, listened, recorded, and waited. But vengeance, like fruit on a bough, ripens in its season, and mine had ripened at last. It began not with a shout but with a whisper. I let slip, carefully and deliberately, the truth of our blood to those who would find it most scandalous. A word to a rival family, cloaked as an innocent remark. A reminder to the chaplain of the day he stumbled over the banns. A hint to the steward's wife, who had ears quicker than her tongue. Each whisper was a drop of poison into the well of his reputation. He prided himself on being admired. I would make admiration curdle into suspicion. The cracks spread faster than I expected. A cousin at a feast refused his goblet, muttering something about impure bonds. A merchant bowed less deeply than before. At chapel, I noticed parishioners crossing themselves more fervently, their eyes darting toward us with unease. He sensed it, though he could not place its source. I saw it in the stiffness of his shoulders, the sharpness in his voice when he barked at servants. Pride turned sour when it met doubt, and doubt was the gift I gave him daily. But whispers alone could not finish him. I wanted the blow to be final, undeniable, beyond repair. And so I turned to the law itself, the same law I had studied by candlelight, the same words I had traced with trembling fingers. The canon forbidding unions of such close kin was clear, and though noble houses had bought dispensations before, I knew ours had none. I had seen the chest, I had counted the seals. He stood upon a foundation of rot, and I would bring the house down upon him. The chance came during the midsummer feast, when lords and ladies gathered to celebrate our household's supposed strength. The hall was filled with banners, the air thick with the smell of roasted meats and spiced wine. He stood at the high table, goblet in hand, boasting once again of legacy and blood. He raised his voice so all could hear, praising our union as the jewel of the family's future. And that was when I struck. I rose, calm and steady, my face serene. I asked for the priest's blessing, and when silence fell, I spoke. I recited the canon law word for word, my voice unwavering. I declared before them all that our marriage was no sacred union, but a forbidden sin, a violation of God's command and the Church's order. Gasps rippled through the hall, faces turned pale. The chaplain stammered, caught in the trap of his own silence. And my husband, my brother, stood frozen, his goblet trembling in his hand. The weight of truth is heavier than any sword. He tried to laugh, to wave it away as the hysterics of a barren wife, but I had prepared well. From my sleeve I drew the ledger, the pages I had filled over years of captivity. Dates, names, evidence of his cruelty, records of the missing dispensation. I read aloud the entry that proved no lawful allowance had ever been granted for our union. The room erupted into chaos, lords shouting, ladies covering their faces, servants whispering prayers. The mask he had worn so carefully 4 years shattered in an instant. His downfall was not dramatic in the way of stories told by men. There was no duel, no sudden execution. Instead, there was something slower, more humiliating. The church opened an inquiry. Rivals seized upon the scandal, whispering it in courts and councils. His allies withdrew their support, unwilling to be tainted by the stink of sin. He was mocked, doubted, treated as less than the man he had always believed himself to be. His voice no longer carried weight. His commands were questioned, his boasts ridiculed. He, who had once stood so tall, now walked like a man chased by shadows. And I was freed. Though freedom came wrapped in the cloak of shame they tried to place upon me. They called me unfaithful, treacherous, a wife who had betrayed her husband, but I wore their accusations as armor. For I knew the truth. I had not betrayed him. I had avenged myself. They had betrayed me long before I raised my voice. I simply returned the gift. In the quiet of my chamber, I thought of all the girls whose names had been lost to silence. I thought of the lambs fattened for slaughter, the brides dressed in lace to hide their chains. I thought of the ones who had not lived long enough to strike back. And I whispered their names, though no one else remembered them. For I had carried not only my own vengeance, but theirs as well. As for him, his end was not marked by blood, but by ruin. He lived, yes, but in disgrace. He drank more, laughed less, wandered the halls like a ghost of his former self. Once, I passed him in the courtyard, and he met my eyes with a hatred so raw it almost burned. Yet behind that hatred was fear. He knew that I had undone him with a sword, but with words. And words, once spoken, can never be taken back. They forced me to marry my brother. They told me it was destiny, duty, God's will, but I chose my own fate. I chose to survive, to endure, to wait, and finally, to strike. I chose revenge, not silence. And though the world may forget my name, though they may try to write me out of their chronicles, I know the truth. I was not the jewel of his crown. I was the stone that shattered it. And so, when I look back upon the path I walked, from the house of shadows to the wedding in chains, through the mask of a brother and the rot of bloodlines, to the revenge that waited, and finally the fate I chose, I see not tragedy, but defiance. They may have broken others, they may have thought to break me, but in the end, it was I who broke them. History remembers kings, battles, and crowns, but it forgets the girls who were forced into chains for the sake of bloodlines. This is not just one story. It is the story of countless forgotten lives, bound and betrayed. If you found this story powerful, subscribe for more tales of betrayal, revenge, and history uncovered. And share this with someone who should know the dark truths hidden beneath the surface of our past.